The Guadalcanal Campaign, a strategic turning point. The genesis of conflict. January 5, 1942, marked a pivotal moment in the Pacific Theater. While triumphant celebrations echoed through Tokyo's streets, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto directed his Imperial Combined Fleet staff to commence preparations for the war's second operational phase. His careful examination of intelligence reports from the Philippines, Malaya, and Southern Territories suggested Japanese forces would achieve dominance across East Asia within months of their December offensive. This assessment prompted Yamamoto to instruct his Chief of Staff, Mato Mugaki, to finalize strategic plans by mid-February. The remarkable velocity of Japan's Western Pacific conquests astonished Tokyo's military planners, simultaneously generating profound disagreements within the Imperial General Staff. One faction of fervent military nationalists advocated continued offensive operations regardless of geographical extent, driven by the momentum of successive victories. A contrasting group, exemplified by Admiral Yamamoto himself, harbored reservations about initiating hostilities against the United States and Britain, expressing deep concerns regarding long-term strategic outcomes. Yamamoto's presence aboard the combined fleet flagship Yamato reflected concerns among Imperial General Staff allies that remaining in Tokyo might expose him to assassination attempts, given his vocal opposition to unlimited warfare. His perspectives remained transparent to colleagues. Chief of Staff Admiral Ugaki documented in his personal diary the necessity for visionary statesmanship following the initial month of spectacular military success. These sentiments echoed Yamamoto's frequent warnings that sustained conflict with Western powers offered no viable path to long-term victory. Yamamoto's public criticism targeted Prince Kono and political leaders who appeared uncertain about Japan's proper strategic direction in the Pacific. 3 months preceding the Pearl Harbor operation, Yamamoto met with Ryoichi Sasakawa, president of the ultra-nationalist Kokusui-do organization, at the Imperial Navy Club in Shiba. During this conversation, Yamamoto warned his associate that war had become inevitable due to political decisions, predicting that Japan would initially experience overwhelming success, expanding like an octopus, extending its tentacles across the region. A mere month into the conflict, this prediction had materialized. The octopus had indeed spread nearly to its maximum extension. However, Yamamoto had also cautioned Sasakawa that this euphoric period would prove temporary. He identified the fall of Singapore as the critical moment for political action, believing that such a disaster would destabilize British control in India, creating conditions favorable for peace negotiations. Yamamoto possessed intimate knowledge of the British, having served as a delegation member during the 1930 and 1934 London naval conferences. His understanding of Americans was equally comprehensive, developed during his tenure as Japanese naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. While acknowledging that once politicians initiated war, rapid major victories became essential, he believed Japan would enjoy only 18 months of glory following such achievements. "We must secure a peace agreement within that timeframe," he emphasized to Sasakawa, expecting this old friend to convey this message among right-wing political leaders holding power. On January 5, victory appeared imminent. The Pearl Harbor attack on December 7 had neutralized the American battleship fleet. British battleships Repulse and Prince of Wales had been sunk off the Malay coast. In the Philippines, Japanese forces had captured Manila and the United States naval base at Cavite. Hong Kong had surrendered to British forces, while Japanese operations proceeded toward new landings in the Dutch East Indies, at Rabaul on New Ireland, Ambon, and throughout the Solomon Islands. The Pearl Harbor operation, despite its success, had fallen short of Yamamoto's complete objectives, the destruction of major United States fleet elements. The aircraft carriers, having been at sea during the attack, remained unharmed and represented a persistent threat. A spectacular achievement was required, yet Yamamoto did not anticipate Singapore's fall for 5 or 6 months. When it occurred on February 15, he recognized that achieving his negotiation preparation goals required action in alternative directions. The critical question confronting his planners concerned the next strike location. The army rejected Yamamoto's proposal for Soviet Union operations, as such a campaign would unfold primarily on land, and army forces were heavily committed in China and Southeast Asia. 3 alternative proposals emerged. Yamamoto's preferred option involved Indian Ocean operations, attacking Ceylon, drawing out and destroying the British Far Eastern Fleet, mirroring his Pearl Harbor success against American forces, then advancing into the Middle East to connect with German forces driving towards Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. This strategy would guarantee the Japanese Navy's petroleum requirements. The Army declined to consider Middle Eastern operations, leaving only two plans under consideration. One plan, advocated by the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, called for Australian operations to eliminate that forward American base. After securing positions in the Solomon Islands, the Navy would capture New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji and Samoa. Imperial General Headquarters advocates for this strategy were already establishing occupation administration systems for Australia and New Zealand. Yamamoto opposed the Australia plan, believing it would require excessive time while lacking sufficient dramatic impact to halt American momentum. He understood that the Pearl Harbor attack had ignited a spirit of vengeance among people the Japanese had learned to dismiss as soft and incompetent. Too soft, the Army contended, to prosecute war to its conclusion. Even Singapore's capture would clearly not deter the Americans. Yamamoto sought a victory that would enable Japan to extend a magnanimous olive branch. In January, he ordered development of another plan, and 2 months subsequently dispatched officers to Tokyo bearing the document designated the MI Plan, which envisioned a decisive battle near Midway Island where American carrier forces would be annihilated. He simultaneously transmitted the AL Plan to Tokyo, detailing North American continental invasion via Alaska. If circumstances developed favorably, Hawaii would be occupied, and potentially the West Coast thereafter. Minimally, victories at Midway and in the Aleutians would provide politicians with a foundation for negotiating the peace settlement Yamamoto hoped to achieve. In Tokyo, admirals quarreled around Navy Ministry conference tables, but ultimately Yamamoto prevailed. Forgotten was the potential significance of Singapore's February fall and the impending collapse of Bataan and Corregidor, either of which might have served Yamamoto's purposes. Their diminished importance stemmed from Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 Bomber Squadron's April raid on Tokyo. The Doolittle raid shocked the Japanese into realizing that Americans were only beginning their fight. In June, after the Midway operation erupted into disaster for Japan, no time remained for recrimination. Indeed, the Army remained unaware of the defeat's full extent. News of 4 major fleet carriers' destruction was carefully suppressed, known only at the Navy's highest levels. While Yamamoto pursued his Midway excursion, the Naval General Staff in Tokyo had been steadily advancing Navy and Air Forces southward to establish the forthcoming Australia isolation attempt. Naval forces had captured Rabaul on January 23, subsequently conducting constant air reconnaissance and bombing raids against other islands and New Guinea. It became apparent to Australians, who communicated their concerns to General Douglas MacArthur following his March arrival, that the Japanese would soon move against New Guinea. Success there would position the Japanese for a relatively effortless northern Australia conquest. In February, the Japanese had already bombed Darwin. In March, when they invaded Salamor, New Guinea, the operational tempo accelerated. In May, immediately preceding the Midway battle, the Japanese dispatched an occupation force toward Port Moresby, but it was repelled by fierce American and Australian defense during the Coral Sea carrier battle. The Japanese did occupy Tulagi north of Guadalcanal, constructing a seaplane base there. The Coral Sea battle convinced planners in Washington and Australia that they must prepare for a Japanese southern move. MacArthur informed the Australian government it must ready itself for an attack before the generally anticipated Japanese thrust against India. He cabled General Marshall, requesting 2 carriers and 1,000 planes. In Washington that May, Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, informed General Marshall that until June's end he would have only 2 operational carriers in the entire Pacific, while on Midway's eve, the Japanese possessed 10. Pacific Fleet Commander Chester W. Nimitz had already provided advance warning about the major Japanese move he anticipated, which proved to be the Midway battle. While events unfolded at Midway, the Japanese were establishing their forces in the New Guinea Solomons area. Major General Tomitaro Horiai landed the South Seas Force at Salamor, and naval troops occupied La, beginning airbase construction there. Independently of Admiral Yamamoto, the Imperial General Staff had planned the Port Moresby operation. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake was ordered to press toward New Caledonia, Fiji and Samoa, and to prepare for renewed Port Moresby advance by July. That timing would follow the Midway Battle, when Admiral Yamamoto could be expected to return with his combined fleet. That substantial carrier force was expected to protect this new initiative. Despite the Midway defeat, which was reported as a victory to field forces, Imperial General Headquarters did not alter its plans. Several days after Midway, Australians informed General MacArthur that the Japanese were prepared to move. Considering the Midway victory, MacArthur suggested that the Allies execute a preemptive attack on the New Britain-New Ireland area, followed by an assault on Rabaul, the main Japanese naval and air base in the region. With 2 carriers, 1,000 planes and an amphibious division, MacArthur would force the Japanese back to truck. On June 12, General Marshall presented the MacArthur plan to Admiral King with modifications. He wanted 3 carriers instead of 2, plus 1 Marine division and 3 Army divisions for the assaults. Admiral King opposed the idea because it would place MacArthur in command of the fighting. King's other reasons were supplementary. Carriers would be subjected to land-based attack, and they would lack sufficient protection. As circumstances unfolded, the Navy had to address both tactical problems at Guadalcanal. King devised his own plan, a drive from the New Hebrides by Navy-commanded forces. MacArthur objected to having his army forces serve under Navy command, but nobody could deny the necessity of halting the Japanese before they captured New Guinea and positioned themselves to attack Australia. The Joint Chiefs of Staff problem concerned operational command. They assigned Phase 1, the primary task of taking the Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi and adjacent positions, to Admiral King. Guadalcanal was merely a spot on the map with no recognized tactical or strategic value. It didn't even merit a name in this JCS plan. General MacArthur received a consolation. After Phase 1, he would assume control and eliminate remaining Japanese forces in the Solomons, Rabaul and New Guinea. Admiral King received authorization because the Joint Chiefs of Staff recognized that King had already planned a Pacific defense line to protect Australia, and his plan would require relatively fewer forces than MacArthur's proposal. Thousands of troops were training in New Caledonia, and King had persuaded General Arnold to send several United States Army Air Force squadrons there. He had reinforced Samoa and F8 in the New Hebrides, and planned to establish a base in Tonga. Admiral Wilson Brown, whose indecisiveness during the Wake Island crisis had provoked King's annoyance, was transferred to a newly established unit called the Amphibious Training Command at San Diego. He and Marine Major General Holland Smith were directed to develop new island warfare techniques. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, King's chief plans officer, suggested that the first effort must focus on holding the line in the South Pacific while training amphibious forces. The second stage would involve a combined United States-Australia-New Zealand offensive through the Solomon Islands to the Bismarck Archipelago and Admiralty Islands. The third stage would involve seizing the Caroline and Marshall Islands, and the fourth stage would take the Allies either to the Dutch East Indies or to the Philippines. Admiral King approved this plan. It was precisely what he himself envisioned. He made arrangements to bring Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, who was serving as a naval observer in London, to head the South Pacific Command. King detached Rear Admiral Turner from the plan's division and directed him to prepare for assuming command of the amphibious operation. All this occurred even before the Japanese assault on Port Moresby and Tulagi. Vice Admiral Gormley departed Washington on May 1. He would assume command of the South Pacific Force on June 19, but first he had to report to Pearl Harbor to Admiral Nimitz, who would be his direct superior. By the time Gormley reached Pearl Harbor, the Japanese offensive was already beginning in the South Pacific. On May 22, an Army plane spotted a Japanese photo reconnaissance aircraft photographing Guadalcanal. Army intelligence suggested that the Japanese were preparing to construct an airfield there. On June 25, Army intelligence reported that grass on the island's central plain had been burned off and tents had appeared in the area. A wharf was under construction at Lunga. 6 days later, an Australian coast watcher on Guadalcanal reported that airfield construction awaited only the arrival of Japanese construction units. He even knew the names, the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, equivalent to American CB units. This information was confirmed in a radio interception made by Nimitz's intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet's Radio Intelligence Group, which had broken portions of the Japanese naval code, intercepted a message stating that the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces would arrive at their destination on July 4. Fleet intelligence connected the pieces. Admiral Turner happened to be visiting Pearl Harbor that day en route to prepare for the amphibious landing somewhere in the South Pacific. When Admiral Nimitz received the radio intelligence report, Admiral Turner knew his destination. It could be nowhere but the Solomons. Within 2 weeks, Turner was in Wellington, where he boarded his flagship, the USS Macaulay, the former Grace Line passenger ship Santa Barbara. His task was to train an entire amphibious task force in 1 month. As Turner began moving ships and personnel, Admiral Gormley was travelling to Melbourne to confer with General MacArthur. Gormley departed New Zealand with his head filled with gloomy thoughts about the foolishness of attempting to stage an amphibious operation when no one understood how to execute it. MacArthur, who had his own reasons for disliking the plan, agreed with him entirely. They also concurred that with available aircraft, they could not guarantee the landing sufficient air coverage. After all, this meeting occurred on July 18, and the landings were scheduled for 3 weeks hence. They sent a dispatch to Washington recommending that the operation be deferred, but King was not receptive to that message. King had informed his new commander that he was handing him a difficult assignment and that he would not be able to provide him with proper tools until perhaps the fall. The answer was no. The invasion would proceed as planned. Now Gormley had left Washington, convinced that the United States was not ready for aggressive action in the South Pacific. His gloom intensified when he tried and failed to get CBs and other units sent immediately to New Zealand. From the beginning, the Guadalcanal invasion plan was notable for intelligence failures. All concerned commands knew that an operation was forthcoming, particularly after July 10, when Admiral Nimitz sent Admiral Gormley his operations orders. The major Japanese airbase was located at Rabaul. Planes from those fields could stop at Guadalcanal, refuel, and then bomb Australia. There was no doubt they could strike a deadly blow at the Allied build-up. But on July 10, the Allied intelligence service's report reaching King contained only a casual comment about airfield construction at Guadalcanal, and several days later a report located the field on the wrong side of the island. By July's end, the Japanese had completed the airfield. Back at Combined Fleet Headquarters in Japan, Admiral Yamamoto gave orders that the first staged mission would depart Rabaul on August 14. As commander of the overall United States operation, Admiral Gormley desperately tried to get more assistance to build advanced bases and bring in more planes. But everywhere he turned, he learned the truth of Admiral King's assertion that he would not be able to provide Gormley with proper tools. The invasion forces' supplies, for example, were loaded hodgepodge aboard the transports at Oakland. There were plenty of docks, so that the ships could have been unloaded and reloaded with supplies in the order of their intended use. Instead, the ships were sent to Noumea, which had no such facilities. Admiral King had at least a general understanding of the difficulties, but there was no time for delay. King knew better than any of his subordinates the absolute necessity of stopping the Japanese before they reached Australia. The timetable remained. By late July, the rush was on. 17,000 Marines were moving by troopship from California, Pearl Harbor, Noumea and Samoa. Admiral Gormley was too busy to hold a conference of his commanders, but on July 28, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who was supposed to be in tactical command, called a meeting aboard his flagship, the carrier Saratoga. For the first time, the tactical unit commanders met to discuss the invasion. Admiral Fletcher was to protect the invasion with his task force. Admiral Turner was to deliver the troops of Marine General Alexander Vandergrift. Once the Marines had taken the island, garrison troops would be brought in. But so hastily was this operation called that no one had made provision for any troops to be held in reserve. There were no more men available in the South Pacific. The meeting on the Saratoga was not a happy one. Fletcher began by announcing that he would protect the landings at Guadalcanal for only 2 days. He insisted, and Gormley's staff members at the meeting concurred, that the carriers must not be risked. Fletcher was gun-shy. He stated that the whole operation was cockeyed, hasty, and doomed. Admiral Turner, who had a better understanding of the global military picture than any other man in the cabin that day, chided his superior. There was no point in that sort of argument, he said. The decision had been made to risk all. It was their job to carry out orders. Fletcher ought to have known all that. After Coral Sea, Admiral King had been so displeased with Fletcher's constant avoidance of action that he had insisted Admiral Nimitz ascertain the condition of Fletcher's fighting spirit. Nimitz was a kindly man and liked Fletcher. He had given the carrier commander a pep talk. Then, when the Battle of Midway was won, Fletcher, who was in command there, could hardly be faulted. But on the eve of the first American offensive operation, to warn the troops and the men of the support ships that he was going to desert them in 48 hours was a most inauspicious beginning. The rehearsal for the Guadalcanal invasion was staged on July 28 and lasted 3 days. The scene was Coro Island near Fiji. Only a third of the assigned troops managed to get ashore, and when they did, they didn't know what to do. General Vandergrift regarded the mock-up as a complete bust, but there was no time even to second guess. On July 31, the Marines were back aboard the transports heading for Guadalcanal. On the afternoon of August 6, as the task force of 75 ships neared the Solomons, Admiral Fletcher nervously broke away with his carriers. He would have his planes over the landing force as promised, but the 26 ships of the carrier group were being taken as far from harm's way as possible. If American intelligence was so faulty as to permit the Japanese build-up of the airfield at Guadalcanal, Japanese intelligence was faultier. For as the United States invasion fleet massed in the South Pacific, the Japanese had no inkling of a forthcoming attack. In July 1942, the Japanese army was preoccupied with trying to capture New Guinea as a staging point for its operations against Australia and New Zealand. Major General Tomitaro Horiai's South Seas force landed 2,000 troops near Buna. After capturing Buna, the Japanese planned to construct airfields there as a prelude to a new attack on Port Moresby. So in July, Japanese air power was concentrated against Port Moresby. Bombers and fighters swept over the piers and airfields nearly every day. After the Japanese landings, the Japanese air forces were also called on to support the beachhead, and in early August their attention was fixed on the new drive. The combined Australian and American Air Force responded with raids on the Japanese airbases at Lae. During these preparations, Admiral Yamamoto's flagship Yamato was anchored at Hashirajima in Japanese waters. In a leisurely fashion, he was preparing for the forthcoming air operations over Australia, and he would see then what action was to be taken next. In preparation, on August 3, the naval air groups stationed at Lae were brought back to Rabaul to be ready for the Guadalcanal operations that would begin the following week. During the first week of August, the South Pacific skies were cloudy, and only a handful of Japanese search planes took to the skies. None of them found the American armada that was steaming toward Guadalcanal. The Japanese airmen flying out of Rabaul were surprised to encounter American carrier aircraft in the skies around Buna. They had been told that the United States carriers were destroyed at Midway. The pilots assumed that the carriers were operating with Australian forces that had marched across the Owen Stanley Mountains. Actually, they were training for the Guadalcanal invasion. No one in the Imperial High Command or in the field suspected a forthcoming invasion. After their 8 months of continuous victories, it was hard for the Japanese to believe that the Allies could launch a seaborne invasion. Had the idea been suggested, they would have agreed with General MacArthur and Admiral Gormley that such an invasion had almost no chance of success. So as the American Expeditionary Force moved toward Guadalcanal, it enjoyed the element of surprise. On August 4 and 5, the 75 ships steamed on under an overcast sky. On August 6, the fleet moved through rain squalls almost all day long, but as dawn rose on the morning of August 7, the sky cleared, which meant the carrier planes would have good visibility for their attacks. The fleet went to general quarters at 5:30 and at 6:00 the carriers launched their first strike. The planes from the Wasp, Saratoga and Enterprise were assigned targets on Guadalcanal Island, Tulagi, Gavutu and Tanambogo. The Japanese had established a seaplane base on Gavutu and Tanambogo, which were connected by a causeway. The Japanese planes had been kept down the day before by bad weather. Admiral Fletcher's task force reported one unidentified aircraft during the day, but whether it was Japanese or a plane from General MacArthur's command was undetermined. In any event, the Japanese were not aroused until 6:12 a.m., when the communications headquarters at the Tulagi seaplane base sent a frantic message announcing the attack. The radio message went to the 4th, 6th and 8th Fleets, Admiral Yamamoto and Imperial headquarters. It was simple and succinct: enemy heavy bombardment in progress. The weather had cleared, and the carrier planes flew off into scattered cumulus clouds in the light of a quarter moon. The fighters and bombers moved off on their appointed missions. 8 fighters led by Lieutenant L.H. Bauer took off from the Enterprise to attack Guadalcanal's aircraft, PT boats, troop installations, and supply dumps. They found no aircraft and no PT boats, and they did strafe the buildings on the airfield at Lunga Point. Meanwhile, another 8 fighters from the Enterprise maintained a combat air patrol over the transport anchorage from 6 until 8:00, when they were replaced by others. Bombers began to hit Tulagi and the Lunga Point area, but no enemy air activity was seen all morning. The Americans had it all to themselves, and the only planes damaged were those hurt in operational accidents. Planes from the other carriers struck the seaplane base at Gavutu. The surprise was complete. The American planes arrived and began bombing and strafing the seaplanes in the water. They destroyed 9 float planes similar to the Zero, 1 4-engine Kawanishi flying boat, and 8 seaplanes that doubled as search planes and bombers. A few Japanese pilots who tried to take off were shot down before they were airborne. Not a single Japanese plane at Gavutu survived the attack. Other carrier planes hit Japanese troop concentrations on Tulagi. Some struck targets on the beaches that the Marines would soon invade. Before dawn, the Marines on the decks of the transports could see the high mountains of the island that was their objective. The transport slipped through the narrow neck that runs between Guadalcanal and Savo Islands into Sealark Channel. As dawn rose, the guns of the escorting warships fired, and flashes of light illuminated the fleet. There was virtually no answering fire. The bombardment from the cruisers and destroyers accompanying the troop ships started fires along the shore. An oil dump exploded, sending flames leaping into the sky. At 8:00, after 2 hours of bombing and shelling of the island, the landing craft began to move toward the north shore east of Lunga Point. The Marines were nervous. Neither they nor their officers had any practical experience in such a landing, for this was the first American amphibious invasion since the Spanish-American War. At 9:00, troops were landing on Guadalcanal. They met no resistance because the Japanese had fled into the hills. The going was ridiculously easy. The Marines soon saw how completely they had surprised the enemy. They came across wooden barracks that had never been slept in. They found a tent with a breakfast table full of platters and bowls of meat, rice, and cooked plums. There were half-filled rice bowls scattered around, chopsticks hastily dropped on the table or on the straw mats of the floor. The tents themselves told why the Japanese had left so rapidly. They were torn by shrapnel, and some were knocked flat by the shelling of the naval vessels before the landing. But any Marine who felt like celebrating over the ease with which they had taken their early objectives had some shocks coming. It was true that the Japanese had been surprised on Guadalcanal, and they had not dug in yet nor created permanent fortifications, because most of the men were construction troops, not fighting men. But over on Tulagi, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Marine Raider Battalion and the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines had encountered stout resistance. About 250 Japanese were located on this island. The Japanese were troops of the Yokohama Air Base Detachment under Captain Hamasaki Miyazaki. They were experienced and dedicated fighters. Edson's 1st Raiders were the toughest American troops in the Pacific. They were all volunteers chosen from the ranks of a force known for its fighting qualities. The Raider concept had come from Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's recommendation for creation of a commando force, and Carlson's experience had included a service tour of several months with the Chinese Communist 8th Route Army in its guerrilla struggles against the Japanese in North China. Edson's Raiders had trained for many months under Spartan conditions, and when they came to Guadalcanal, they already had a powerful reputation. As it turned out, they would need every trick they had learned and would learn some new ones. This invasion was the first contact between highly trained American troops and seasoned Japanese veterans since the war had begun in December. The Japanese had a reputation even more fearsome than that of the Raider battalions, gained through the phenomenally rapid march of their forces through the Philippines, Malaya, and the East Indies. For months, Tokyo had crowed over its victories, and half the world had come to believe the Japanese were invincible, a reputation the Imperial High Command was pleased to encourage. Tulagi then was in a sense the first testing ground. Edson's troops landed at 8:15 a.m. on the northwestern part of the island, and at the beginning the going did not seem much harder than it was on Guadalcanal. They encountered some resistance from a few outposts. The northwest part of Tulagi was covered with thick jungle, small trees, vines, and bougainvillea with its beautiful leaves and sharp thorns. At first, the terrain seemed to be the worst obstacle. Edson lost only one man, and that one to a sniper, as the Marines hit the beach. Edson planned to move inland to a ridge that ran the length of the island and then work along the top of that ridge, clearing the slopes as they moved south. But the terrain was so difficult that it took 3 hours for the men to chop their way along 1.5 miles of rising ground. Having reached the ridge line, the Marines moved ahead, came out of the jungle, and ran straight into the central Japanese defenses built on the hillside. The Japanese had constructed dugouts and rock emplacements and had placed their machine guns carefully to create interlocking fields of fire. The Japanese defense was based on keeping the enemy below them, but the Marines found that by crawling up the cliffs, they could drop charges of dynamite and grenades into the dugouts, and that was the method they had to use to advance. Once a dugout was blown, it still was not safe. In one hole, the Americans killed 17 Japanese with dynamite charges. One Marine spotted a radio inside and went in to retrieve it. There were still 2 Japanese soldiers alive, and they shot him and another man who came after him before they were killed. One section of Marines took on this defense position in the center of the island, while the center and left flank of Edson's force pushed down the ridge. But even along the ridge line, the going was not easy. One company suffered 15% casualties that first afternoon. The frontal resistance was stiff, but with the Japanese, frontal resistance was only half the battle. Snipers seemed to be everywhere, tied in trees, in the tops of buildings, behind rocks. A favorite tactic of the snipers was to let the forward element of a Marine unit pass and then begin shooting at the men from behind. This move almost always meant death for the sniper, but usually not before he had caused several casualties. And one thing the first raiders learned that day was that the small .25 caliber Japanese rifle and machine gun slug were more apt to wound than to kill, which from the Japanese point of view was satisfactory, since it took additional troops and resources to care for the wounded. During the afternoon, the raiders drove along the ridge until they ran into a 3-sided ravine, whose floor was an old British cricket field. The Japanese had dug into the ravine walls and established the fields of fire that would become so familiar in later months. As the Marines moved up, they ran into crossfire, and Edson stopped because darkness was coming, and this was no time to be probing unknown dangers. That night, the Marines on Tulagi had another new experience. The Japanese, knowing they were outnumbered with no chance of survival, staged one of the death-desperate counterattacks for which they would become infamous. They waited until the Marine perimeter was quiet, then at 10:30 p.m. they broke through between 2 companies and surrounded one of them. The Marines fought in their foxholes and in the open, using guns, machine guns, grenades and knives. The Japanese came along the ridge toward Colonel Edson's command post and reached a point 50 yards from him. Finally, the Marines overpowered the Japanese and threw them back, but not before one company had lost half its non-commissioned officers. The next day, August 8, more troops were landed on Tulagi until there were 7,500 on that side of Sealark Channel. Edson's raiders and men of the 5th Battalion of the 2nd Marines began moving again toward the southeastern end of the island. One by one, they attacked the dug-in machine gun positions on the steep sides of the old cricket ground. From one cave they removed 35 dead Japanese, some of them already rotting and stinking, but some killed in the last moment of defense of the position. From this, the Americans deduced properly that the Japanese tactic was to hold a position until the last unless ordered to retreat, proof of the discipline of the Japanese armed forces. Those troops who surrendered on Guadalcanal were mostly members of labor battalions, not combat troops. The raiders that second day encountered dozens of examples of a spirit they had not seen before. In one dugout, they cornered 3 Japanese officers who at the end had only one loaded pistol among them. As the Marines were ready to make the final assault, they heard 3 shots. When they entered the dugout, they discovered 3 bodies and an empty pistol. One officer had fired all but his last 3 rounds, then shot his 2 companions and himself. In those first days, this suicidal attitude surprised the Marines. It was hard for an American to understand how cornered or wounded men with no hope of survival in their hole, knowing that the enemy had an immense material and numerical advantage, would almost invariably choose death to surrender. It took some getting used to. But after a few Japanese had pretended to surrender only to pull out guns or bayonets to attack their captors, or to explode grenades to kill themselves and their enemies, the Marines took the Japanese on their own terms. Thereafter, there was virtually no further attempt to persuade Japanese soldiers to surrender. Tulagi was brought under control on that second day, although not all the Japanese on the island had been killed. For days afterward, Japanese snipers harassed the American troops until the last sniper was killed. One gets a feel for the stubbornness of the fighting on Tulagi in the experience of Gunnery Sergeant Angus Goss. He had gone ahead of his men to attack a cave near the cricket field. The Japanese had fired sporadically from that position. He moved up close enough to throw hand grenades into the cave, and the Marines had been trained to pull the ring, pin of the egg-shaped grenade, throw, count slowly, and hear the explosion. Sergeant Goss pulled the pin through and counted, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The grenade was lobbed back out of the cave, and he had to duck to escape the blast of his own weapon. After another identical experience, he held the grenade for 3 seconds, then threw, 4, 5, 6, and out it came again. Sergeant Goss called for a satchel charge, a bag filled with dynamite usually used to blow buildings. He thrust in the charge, primed it, and ran back a little. The Japanese thrust the charge out of the mouth of the cave. The dynamite exploded and drove a rock splinter into Goss's leg. The wound was not serious enough to faze him, but it hurt enough to infuriate him. He picked up his submachine gun and dashed into the cave, spraying fire. He killed 4 Japanese soldiers and counted 8 others who had died earlier. If possible, the fighting on Gavutu and Tanambogo was worse than that on Tulagi. The landings there came in the middle of the morning. Not many troops were committed because no one expected to find many Japanese there. But since the seaplane base was on these islands, the Japanese had fortified them, and the Marines ran into trouble.